First of all, Minister and colleagues, I just want to join with you in acknowledging, first of all, Sheila and Catherine in the gallery, and to also acknowledge, I suppose, the profound detrimental impact that the residential institutional abuse had on survivors, not just at the time, but since and right up to modern day. And I just want to join as well with Senator Corley in acknowledging Senator Boyan on his passionate speech today, but in all his advocacy work in this area, and just bring it home to us what it really means to have been a survivor of something like this. I want to quote Maeve Lewis of 1 in 4, as she stated at the committee: survivors of abuse in institutional care were abysmally failed by the Irish state in their early years, and it is incumbent now on us as a society to ensure at the age that they are afforded the highest quality appropriate services that they so richly deserve. And I do acknowledge that the bill goes quite some way to providing adequate supports for survivors, but I do feel, unfortunately, that there are some aspects of the bill that are unfortunate, in that the first one is that it excludes certain people, and we know the Residential Institutions Redress Board was limited to 139 institutions, so there were some institutions excluded at the time, but there were even people within those 139 institutions that didn't apply for redress because they didn't understand exactly what the redress was for. And at the time, we didn't have an organisation like Sage Advocacy to help support people to apply for the supports that they were entitled to. So I do acknowledge and I welcome the fact that Sage Advocacy is there, but unfortunately there are people who have been excluded for different reasons, and they do require support, because I think it's re-traumatising for them to be admitted from this, so having suffered such abuse as a young person in an institution like this, to again suffer a double abuse of being ignored when it comes to receiving support. The once-off payment for those living overseas of €3,000 I don't feel is sufficient either. We have a rising cost of living, and I think if it could be linked to inflation, because as time goes by, if this is built into legislation, €3,000 is not going to change. It's become less and less, having less and less impact as time goes on. So I really do think that should be re-looked at to see, could it be increased, and, as I said, linked to inflation. And we need to recognise, as you say, approximately it is estimated that 1/3 of people live in Britain who will qualify for support. And I know that Liam Conlon, the MP, has introduced Philomena's Law in March in the House of Commons in Westminster, and that's progressing through at the moment. And I would just ask that the Department of Education would liaise with the UK's Department of Work and Pensions to ensure that any person living in Britain who is eligible for support because of the institutional abuse is not affected by having their payments means tested against this support. I think that would be vitally important, and I know that was already done for those who live north of the border. In relation to the enhanced medical card, I recognise it's a medical card without review and without means test, and that's very important. But I also feel possibly that many people were traumatised by what happened to them and are still traumatised, and if we could be increased to include specialised therapy that is trauma related, and helping people to deal with the trauma, and recognise it's intergenerational as well, and that if a parent suffered trauma like that, it's going to have affected their children and possibly their children again, and we should open up more support for families rather than just the individual. In relation to housing supports, anyone who has endured such treatment as a child should never face the added trauma of possibly becoming homeless, and I think priority needs to be given to people who have survived institutional abuse to get priority for housing supports within our social housing system. I think that's vitally important. In relation to, I know Senator Boylan raised the point of money for religious institutions. Some money has been paid over, but I don't think it's been sufficient. I don't think every institution has paid it, and I do think, again, that this should be sought from these institutions. I do recognise that the state bears responsibility because the state allowed these institutions to care for the children without proper monitoring, but the state institutions and those within it need to bear responsibility also, and I know there's been evidence of them trying to hide money and hide assets, and that's just abhorrent. So pressure should be brought on all the religious institutions to pay a contribution. I do want to acknowledge others like those who, as been mentioned here, were boarded out. I would know people in my community who were boarded out as children to families. I know my parents knew lots of others that were boarded out at the time. It was a common practice when they were young. And they said, right, well, some families looked after those children very well, many did not, and they were treated like slaves, and it is unfortunate that they are being ignored in every sort of support that's been provided, and that needs to happen. I just, think of children for whatever reason who ended up in a residential institution, sometimes because of bereavement within the family, sometimes for other reasons. Those children were vulnerable. Many of them were already grieving, and then to be put into an institution where they suffered further abuse, be it physical, psychological or sexual abuse, it was absolutely dreadful. And my heart goes out to everybody who's been affected. And also to, I suppose, sometimes we forget about children who suffered extreme physical abuse in our day schools as well, and there were horrific stories told last year, and I've talked to individuals as well, and they recall that absolutely horrendous what happened, and I know there's a different process for that, but just to mention them here. So Minister, sorry, I'll allow my colleague to proceed. Apologies.